The story of our civilization begins with the story of just one man. After God had formed him from the dust of the earth and breathed life into him, God called him Adam, whose name means simply, of the earth. A fitting name for him and for all of us who follow after him, for just a moment and the moment's gone, just a breath and the breath is gone, returning to the places from where they came. God taught Adam many different truths, but above all else, God taught Adam the importance of naming things what they are. For in the honesty of a name is hidden a great secret that no amount of space or time can obscure, if you have the desire to simply look and discover for yourself the truth hiding there in plain view. This is the Gihon spring today. The name Gihon means the great breaking forth of the waters. The Gihon was the fountain source of the three other rivers that flowed through the garden, the Pishon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. Does this look like something Adam would have named the great breaking forth of the waters? This is something closer to the Gihon Adam would have experienced. But even this is too small. You have to picture something 10 times larger. Besides that, you have to picture it upside down. This is something Adam would have called the great breaking forth of the waters. But wait. Before we can understand Jerusalem, we have to understand how Satan tried to destroy it, even before it was founded.
This is Nimrod, the first man who tried to take over the world. And this is the city that he built. It housed a temple that pointed an accusing finger at God. Nimrod lied to the world, saying that all who believed in him would never see death. And the generations after the flood flocked to Babel to worship the evil Nimrod. They would scream in defiance at the God above, saying, "We have as our God now Nimrod, who has built us a city and a temple that reaches all the way to heaven. So do your worst, for we will never die."
Even a whole generation before Jerusalem existed, Satan had deceived mankind into polluting the three things that make Jerusalem great: the city, the temple, and its name. Even today, 4,000 years later, Nimrod's legacy is all around us, for the world is filled with temples that point an accusing finger at God. But that's the counterfeit Jerusalem, the one the whole world knows. But what about the true Jerusalem? Where's the story of the true Jerusalem? How did it come about? Who founded it? And why is it situated where it is today? Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Shem was the second son, but he is always named first because he honored God with his life. As the day of Noah's death dawned, God's priest Melchizedek joined his family in a celebration of Noah's life. As he lay dying, Noah asked Shem to return to the land where the ark had come to rest and retrieve the bones of Adam that Noah had carried with them on the ark. He told him to take Melchizedek with him, for the journey would be long and dangerous. Noah told Shem to retrieve the bones of Adam and return them to the fountainhead of the rivers and the seas and to the structures of the earth. Shem and Melchizedek traveled far to the site of the resting ark. Along the way, Shem told Melchizedek all the stories about God and Adam and all his ancestors that Shem had heard from Noah, all about the times before the flood. Together they retrieved the bones of Adam and traveled to the land of the great breaking forth of the waters, the fountainhead of the Gihon, on the eastern side of Mount Moriah, in the city that we now call Jerusalem. Melchizedek blessed Shem and stayed and became the first king of Jerusalem, the first king of peace, the king of righteousness, the king who washed the feet of Abraham, celebrating the first Passover and the first Thanksgiving. We still celebrate today when we thank God for all the blessings that God has heaped upon us because of the obedience of Abraham. Do you ever wonder why God commanded Abraham to travel from Ur in the northeast to Haran in the northwest and then on to Goshen in Egypt? It was because God wanted Abraham to see in his lifetime the Garden of Eden, even though after the flood it had changed so much. God still wanted Abraham to see the land. It is for our benefit today that these stories are told and retold throughout the generations, so that we are all reminded of how great a heritage we have, and how great and awesome the God of Israel is, and how solemn our responsibility is to worship him in honor and in truth. Abraham and Sarah had one son together, Isaac. The name Isaac means laughter. He was called Isaac because Sarah laughed when God told her she and Abraham would have a son, even though both of them were well into their 90s. Isaac and Rebekah had twin sons, Esau and Jacob. They named the first son Esau because he was very hairy. And the second son came out holding onto Esau's heel, so they called him Jacob. The name Jacob means supplanter, someone who lies and cheats. When Jacob was running for his life after cheating Esau out of his birthright, God sent Jacob a dream, emphasizing to Jacob that he had a plan for Abraham's descendants, and that God's plan still stands. Jacob's uncle Laban gave Jacob a taste of his own medicine, tricking him into marrying Leah when he was in love with Rachel. Jacob worked hard for his uncle for years and years, and those years changed Jacob. Finally, after 20 years, Jacob had to run for his life again. This time, it was Laban's sons who were jealous of his wealth. They wanted to kill him and steal everything he had earned working for his uncle. God had one more job for Melchizedek. Melchizedek had to cross the Jordan and challenge Jacob before God would allow him to recross. Melchizedek tracked Jacob and found him alone after sending his wives and his children and all of his possessions across the Jordan ahead of him. Jacob was just lying in the darkness, thinking about all the years that had passed since he had last seen Esau. He was terrified of Esau. He knew Esau was a great hunter, and he was deathly afraid that Esau still wanted to kill him. So you can imagine how terrified he was when Melchizedek jumped out of the bushes and attacked him. At first Jacob thought it was Esau, but even in the darkness Jacob could tell it wasn't hairy Esau. He thought it might be one of Esau's men, but the stranger wasn't trying to kill him, only wrestle with him. Jacob kept yelling, "Who are you? Who are you?" Wrestling and wrestling. They wrestled each other until sunrise. And finally, Melchizedek spoke. "Who are you?" he asked Jacob coldly. "My name is Jacob," Jacob replied. "You will no longer be known as Jacob. From now on, you will be called Israel, God's prince, because you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed." Israel didn't realize it then, but God had to change his name because he had caused God to modify his plan slightly. God's original plan was to bless Abraham's descendants, making them a nation and a company of nations, of kings and of priests, being taught by him through his high priest and blessed by him as they followed his teachings. God hoped that the Gentile nations would see how Israel behaved and how they were blessed by following God's ways. God hoped that they would copy Israel's ways and turn to him and be blessed as well. That was God's original plan. But Jacob obtained the birthright by deceit. He didn't even know who God's high priest was. It took God 20 years to change Jacob's character before his plan could move forward. But Jacob did change into Israel, and now God could work with Israel's 12 sons to bring his plan into fruition. A famine caused Jacob and his family to move to Egypt, and from there his descendants grew in numbers, sadly, without knowledge of their God, except for a few vague stories about the patriarchs. Finally, After 400 years, God had had enough. He raised up Moses to lead them out of Egypt and into the promised land, hopefully to fulfill their destiny of being God's example to the world. But Israel would have none of it. They stubbornly clung to their way of doing things, to honoring God in a way that was right in their own eyes, despite having Moses to learn from. Israel didn't want to be an example. Israel didn't want the responsibility. Israel wanted to be like the other nations. They wanted a king to lead them, just like the other nations, even though God warned them that man's government would take away all of their most precious possessions. We alive today can see the tragic result of our ancestors rejecting God's leadership with the last 3,000 years of almost uninterrupted war. Israel rejected God, but God did not reject Israel. God figured he could work with Israel's king, and the king would lead Israel back to him. So God chose Saul to lead Israel, but Saul was unable to stay close enough to God in order to rule a people as difficult and as divisive as the Israelites. The pressures of leadership started to get to him, and he began to crack up, eventually dying in battle. Following the death of Saul, God made David king. David moved the royal court to Hebron, where the patriarchs are buried. There, the heads of each of the 12 clans came to pledge allegiance to him as their king. This was both a great honor and a great consternation to David. A great honor because David was truly a humble person. A great consternation because Hebron was part of the land allotted to Judah, and David knew the other 11 clans would always be inclined to accuse him of favoritism. And so David cast a lustful glance at a stronghold right in the heart of Canaan, Jerusalem. Only it wasn't called Jerusalem then. It was called Japheth. Japheth was held by a tough tribe of Canaanite warriors, the Jebusites. The Jebusites loved to live on the hilltops and the mountains because those places were easily defensible, and none more so than Jerusalem. But Ornan, the king of the Jebusites, had something even stronger than the walls of Jerusalem to protect him. His ancestors had passed down to him a contract they had signed with the patriarch Abraham. It was during the days that Sarah had just died, and a heartbroken Abraham wanted to bury her in a cave on the hillside at Machpelah. Only the Jebusites owned the hill and the hillside and the cave, and the Jebusites knew God's promises to Abraham, so they would only negotiate the sale of the cave at Machpelah with Abraham if he would pledge that neither he nor his descendants would ever invade Jebusite land against the will of the Jebusites. And Ornan, king of the Jebusites, had copies of that original contract written in bronze and stone some 700 years later. Now David, king of the Israelites, very much coveted the stronghold of Jerusalem, and Ornan, king of the Jebusites, knew it. When David and his army gathered at the base of Jerusalem's wall, Ornan would appear by himself at the top of the wall, standing between 2 statues, one of bronze and the other of stone. The statues were copies of Israel's high priest. Only one had his eyes gouged out to appear to have been made blind, and the other had no feet and stood on crutches in order to appear lame. Both had copies of the Jebusite contract with Abraham hanging around their necks, hanging where the 12 stones would hang on the temple high priest. And Ornan would yell down at David, "The king of Israel says that the God of Israel is the one and only true God, maker of heaven and earth, and that the gods of Canaan are but lame and blind figures of bronze and stone. King David, behold the gods of Canaan." And then Ornan would point to the statues on either side of him. "I call this one Isaac, and I call this one Jacob." And David could hear all the Jebusites laughing on the other side of the wall. And then Ornan got careless, and he boasted, "If the great God of Israel can defeat these 2 lame and blind gods of Canaan, and throw them from our wall, then I will give you this city, David, and all the Jebusites will serve you. Now go away, you're just bothering me." And all the Jebusites laughed. David went away from the wall, incandescent with anger. He had prayed and God had answered. He was to take Jerusalem. But when he asked how he was to take Jerusalem, God was silent. David racked his brain for weeks trying to come up with an answer. Finally, in a fit of desperation he would live to regret, he offered the leadership of his army to anyone who could figure out how to take Jerusalem. Again, it is for our benefit today that this story is handed down to us, because when Joab entered the cave and dove into the outlet of the Gihon spring, he knew it meant he was either going to reach the other side or he was going to die trying. He couldn't walk. He had to struggle and strain and push through the darkness against the flow. He couldn't see. It was pitch black. He had to push again and again to move forward, praying for a spot where he could raise his head above the water, where he could breathe and rest. He had no reference points. He only knew that he had to push against the flow. He had no idea how far he'd gone or how much farther he had to go. He had to have faith in God, that God would bless him, and he had to persevere in order to reach Zion. When Joab climbed the wall and threw the Canaanite statues over it, smashing them to bits, a great cheer went up from the Israelite camp. True to his word, Ornan opened the gate and gave Jerusalem to David, pledging the allegiance of all the Jebusites to the Israelite king. In return, David was also very gracious to Ornan, giving him Mount Moriah, which contained the Gihon spring, the only source of flowing water in the city. David set up his home in the citadel on Mount Zion, just adjacent to the southeast of Mount Moriah. Ornan was a very, very funny guy. He and David became close friends and remained friends for the rest of their lives. These became pretty heady days for David. Hiram, the king of Tyre, offered to build David a new palace encompassing all of Mount Zion. All of the Jebusites all over Canaan now served him. There were no more strange gods for the Jebusites, at least in theory. All the 12 tribes paid homage to him. Gifts from all over the territory started arriving in Jerusalem. David had even managed to bring the Ark of the Covenant up from the house of the Gittite, Obed-Edom. Everything was going so well. But when he looked down on the tent containing the ark pitched in his courtyard, David felt ashamed. Here he was living in this glorious castle, getting nicer every day, adorned with all manner of beautiful handiwork and beautiful furniture, and down there was God's throne, living in a tent, getting rained on or baking in the sun. David wanted to build a beautiful home for the ark and told Nathan of his plan. Nathan, Israel's high priest, impetuously congratulated David on his plan. And then, just a few hours later, Nathan was humbled to learn that he had to go and tell David that God disapproved of his plan. God told David, a man after his own heart, that David had too much blood on his hands to build him a house. Instead, God would build David a house, a kingdom that would last forever, and he would make sure that one of his descendants would sit on the throne ruling that kingdom forever. David was humbled and very thankful. Now when he looked down on the tent holding the ark, down in the courtyard, he praised God. And David was blessed more and more and more and more and more. He grew so powerful and so successful that he became arrogant and filled with pride. One day, David ordered Joab to take a census of his army. He wanted to boast about the size of his army in front of visiting kings in order to intimidate them. David knew it was God that was giving David's armies their glorious victories. He knew he was insulting God by numbering his army, but he didn't care. David was puffed up with arrogance, and he wanted his own way. After the census was finished, God told Nathan that he had to go and tell David that he had been judged. God gave David his choice of 3 punishments: 3 years of famine, 3 months of military defeats, or 3 days of plague. David chose 3 days of plague because he knew that God would be much more merciful than his enemies, or even his own people. But when the news of death after death after death after death from all of the 12 tribes started arriving in Jerusalem, David cried out in anguished prayer for God to stop hurting his innocent people. When David raised his head and opened his eyes after crying out to God in prayer, God allowed David to see the avenging angel paused by God just as he was about to strike the people of Jerusalem. The angel was hovering above Mount Moriah, the threshing floor of his neighbor Ornan. God told Gad, David's personal priest, to go and tell a traumatized David to offer up a sacrifice right where he saw the avenging angel. David bought the threshing floor from Ornan and offered sacrifices there. And from that point on, the plague stopped, but not before it had cost 70,000 innocent lives. It is a terrifying thing to experience the wrath of God. With the passing of David and the completion of the temple by Solomon, God began to hope again that somehow, with his help, Solomon could lead the nation of Israel to discover their true national destiny. Israel prospered more and more with each passing day under Solomon. The country became so successful, it became known as the Kingdom of Gold. Fabulous golden works of art became common everyday utensils. Although Solomon had the God of Israel to seek guidance from, he began to multiply wives to himself, including hundreds of foreign wives, wives that worshiped foreign gods. And in order to please those foreign wives, Solomon, a man gifted with the wisdom of God, built temples for those foreign wives to worship in, filled them with the idols of metal and stone, and polluted the people and the land, leading Israel into sin and cutting themselves off from the living God. Without God's blessings to keep them, Israel eventually broke down. Invasion after invasion followed. First, the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, followed by the Greeks, and finally the Romans. With the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, Jeremiah was forced to flee with the last of the royal family, first to Egypt, then to Spain, and finally to Ireland. With each successive invasion, the 10 lost tribes retreated farther and farther away from the promised land. I will give the command, and I will sift the people of Israel among all the nations, as grain is shaken in a sieve, yet not a kernel will reach the ground. Eventually, the 10 lost tribes became the Judeo-Christian Western nations that we recognize today. And although our nations are still deeply steeped in idolatry, the blessings of national prosperity had to be delivered by God because God had given his word to Abraham. If we are honest with ourselves, those of us alive today must recognize that we are not worthy of the blessings God has heaped upon our nations. God made the promises of national prosperity to Abraham, and we have received those blessings not because we deserve them, but solely because we are Abraham's descendants. And if we are Abraham's descendants, our national destiny still exists. It is up to us, individually and collectively, each and every one of us, to check out what we believe with God's holy word, the Bible. And if we have been deceived, no matter how that deception came about, we must repent and turn to God to worship him in spirit and in truth. In the 1st century, the Romans took control over Jerusalem. Here is Ernest L. Martin's drawing of the temple in Jesus' day. While historically accurate, it doesn't express the power and the grandeur of the city. Here is the path from the Mount of Olives to the Golden Gate, where the apostles pointed out to Jesus how unbelievably grand the temple was. And here is the plaza where Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers. Here is the corner of the temple where Satan brought Jesus as part of his temptation. This distance is 450 feet, around the height of a 40-story skyscraper, and it's almost straight down. Josephus tells us that the Kidron Brook was only 1 meter away from the base of the wall. When the disciples pointed out how great the temple was, Jesus, the last prophet, prophesied that every stone that they were looking at would be pulled out and thrown down. This prediction came true a mere 40 years later in 70 AD. When the Jews revolted against the Romans in 66 AD, the Romans laid siege to Jerusalem, cutting down every single tree for 10 miles around, and creating a final firestorm that would burn the Jews out of the temple and out of Jerusalem. After the rebellion was quashed, the Roman troops of the 10th Legion pulled apart every stone looking for the temple gold that had melted into the cracks. The Roman troops pulled out all the stones to above the foundation line, and then Titus ordered the rest of the stones to be pulled out so that the Jews would be prevented from rebuilding the wall and then rebuilding the temple. As Jesus Christ had predicted, every single stone of the temple was pulled out and thrown down. Mount Moriah and Mount Zion were completely flattened and then salted. Decades later it became farmland used to feed the troops at the Roman garrison of Fort Antonia. This is Fort Antonia, where the sun worshippers of the Catholic religion and the moon worshippers of Islam have built their temples in the centuries since the destruction of the real temple. Here are some of today's Jews praying at the Wailing Wall. Throughout history, the land of the Jews was invaded so often, the Jewish people took to hiding their valuables in between the stones of their houses. Only today, these people are placing little notes containing their most intimate hopes and wishes and dreams. Unfortunately, these people are blindly following the errors of their leaders. These people are placing notes not in the foundation wall of the temple, as they have been taught to believe, but in the foundation stones of Fort Antonia, of the very people that enslaved them for hundreds of years. This is the Gihon Spring today. This weak, sporadic, ankle-deep flow is a long way away from the channel Joab had to persevere against, and it is another world away from the great breaking forth of waters of the Garden of Eden. Like the temple itself, the awesome grandeur of the Gihon has been wiped from our national consciousness. But God remembers the Gihon. He remembers the Garden of Eden, and he remembers Adam and Abraham and Isaac and Israel and David. He looks at the flow of the Gihon now and knows that the Gihon was like the hair on the head of Samson as he lay chained in the depths of the prison, waiting patiently in his desolation for his salvation to come. Only the Father knows when, but probably one day soon, the Jewish people of the nation that calls itself Israel today are going to recognize the great significance of the location of the Gihon Spring. God is going to allow them to see the error of their ways, and they are going to rebuild the temple in the correct spot. The religions of the world will be ashamed that their ignorance and error has been brought to light for everyone to see, and they will be held in question by the people of the world. At first, the religions of the world will respond with self-righteous political correctness, but soon their jealousy and envy and lust for the prestige of the temple will boil over into anger and greed and covetousness. They will attack the house of Israel in self-righteous, self-serving hypocrisy, and in this one single act, the rebuilding of the temple in its proper place, overlooking the Gihon Spring, will usher in a cataclysmic chain of events that will culminate with the return of Jesus Christ to Jerusalem after an absence of 2,000 years. The question is, will he find faith on the earth?